Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Over the last few days, I've been talking about Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns. Now, there's been a big festival about him here in the UK over the last few days, mainly in the northern parts of the UK, where he came from. Not all of Scotland celebrates his life, however, because in the north of Scotland, there are other poets who are perhaps better known. In the English world, however, Robert Burns remains one of the most iconic characters for quite a number of reasons. One reason, of course, is because he's an icon of Scotland, and many people who immigrated to other countries immigrated with a book of Robert Burns' poems. This was quite normal in the old days. When Scottish people left their home, they took with them a Bible and a book of Robert Burns' poems. Americans love to celebrate Robert Burns. They love to hear about his life, and they have more Burns clubs and institutions than there are in Scotland. It's a way to tap into their heritage. Now, one reason why Robert Burns is indeed so famous is because, like all poets, he deals with myth. Yes, that's right. He brings to life something which otherwise was dead. That could be a historical event. It could be the recording of something. But poetry has a way of reaching the mind very, very quickly. Just like art. You look at a picture and it can make you angry or sad without the need for words. Poetry does that. Eloquent words can really bring about a change in your mood very, very quickly. Now, we're not going to read a poem of Robert Burns today because his writings were mainly in Old Scots. Let me explain. Across the UK, we have varying dialects. We even have different languages. For example, as you know, and I'm sure you've heard me talking before about Gaelic, there's Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh for the people in Wales, and there's also dialects. They sound a little bit like twisted forms of English. And the Scots dialect is still very much alive and used around Scotland, much more than Gaelic. Now, this is very interesting because many people like to explore dialects. Robert Burns was largely an uneducated man, and that's what made him very, very famous. He was considered to be a normal person. He wasn't an aristocrat. He was the son of a farmer. Writing in Old Scots was quite normal for him, and without realizing, he was actually preserving and promoting the dialect. But I'm not here today to talk to you about that. Actually, I'm here today to talk to you about myth. Now, one way in which Robert Burns used myth was that he wrote some poems about imaginary figures. One of these was called Tam O'Shanter. Now, I'm not clear if Tam was a real man, but for sure, the story of Tam and what happened to him according to the poem of Robert Burns, isn't real. The events were almost certainly not based on real events because they involved witches chasing this man called Tam. That's the Scottish word for Tom or Thomas, across an old graveyard by the side of a church, which, by the way, is still there. And if I remember correctly, the grave of the parents of Robert Burns, they're buried in that old graveyard. Anyway, back to the subject of myth. In the poem of Tam O'Shanter, Tam is chased through a graveyard by a bunch of witches. Now, that's rather unlikely, and I think it's commonly believed, and it may even be in the poem, that Tam was rather drunk on his way home. Now, this brings us to a question. How important is myth? And how can it help you in language learning and in storytelling? Another good example in the poems of Robert Burns is another poem he wrote called To a Mouse. And in his own Scots dialect, the correct title of the poem is To a Moose. Moose being the Scottish word for mouse. He addresses the mouse and he calls it a little beast. And he tells a story about mice. Now, how can we take these things into language learning? Well, one immediate way that I can think of, particularly with storytelling, is the exams. In order to get a good mark in the exam, if you're asked to describe a photo, or maybe to describe a life event or a family meeting, is never to simply speak in the present tense. For example, describe a beautiful place. To say, well, there is a beautiful place, it's near my home, it's big, it's a park, kids play in it. That sounds okay from your point of view, but that's not showing the examiner the best of your English. And just the other week, I was talking to a native speaker, and he was telling me that for him, he couldn't pass the IELTS, and he couldn't understand because he is a native speaker. And I was trying to explain to him that the IELTS exam, you need to show them the best of what you can do. Simply to speak in the present tense is never going to be enough. To tell a story is always the way to do it, such as a beautiful place. Well, my grandmother came to visit last week, and we decided to go for a walk. As usual, my grandfather wasn't happy, and he said he didn't want to go. We quickly found a park, and compared to other parks I've seen, this one was particularly stunning. They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but this park really had something for everyone. Now, you can see the difference there by telling a story about my grandmother and my grandfather and this beautiful park. I've managed to use reported speech, a comparative, a proverb within the first 10 seconds of my answer. And this is what you really want to be focusing on when you're asked to describe anything. Now, I call this myth. I admit that it's not a story which is passed down through the generations, but it is an invention. None of it was true, and it was very mythological in nature. I think the difference with real myths, I mean the ones that can be passed on through generations, is that they usually hold in them some kind of universal truth, some kind of a story which teaches us. We're living right now in a time when American psychology is very dominant, and we're supposed to look after the inner child. Yet, some of our old fairy tales and mythological creatures are there to teach us and to help us understand about that one big human mind and just how sacred it is. Robert Burns wrote a lot, tapping into myth, fairy tales, and just recording historical events. One very famous Scottish myth, which, by the way, Robert Burns didn't write about, is the story of the Selkie. The Selkie is a seal, the little animal from the circus, the one that lives in the water. It's like a small otter, and you've probably seen it on TV balancing a rubber ball on its nose. In the Scottish myth about the Selkie, the seal is half human and half seal. They come to the land to enjoy the sunshine, and while they're there, they take off their coat. When they take off their coat, they're human, and they can lie on the beach to get a suntan. But it has been known that some bad humans will steal their seal coat. And when that happens, they can't go back to the sea. They're stuck on land. If a man steals the coat of a female Selkie, she can't return, and she follows the man, often marrying him, settling down and having children. But if she ever finds her coat again, she'll steal the children away and immediately get back into the sea. The male Selkies are often a little bit kinder. Even if a woman does steal their coat, they're a little bit more loyal. These creatures of the sea, I suppose, represent the story of transformation, of change, of patience, and of waiting. Myth is a very important thing for all of us, and in each of our countries, I'm sure we all have our mythologies. One thing is for sure, it's something that I want to explore in future podcasts. Speaking more about the Selkies and the other supernatural mythological creatures of the northern part of the UK. One of them you know already is Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. And this is a kind of example that we can look at again and again. Not only with mythological creatures, but with storytelling in general. Really seeking affirmation from that great mind. And in doing so, we can discover new words, new stories, new people, new creatures which aren't real. We can delve into that mystery and enjoy it for what it is, a very innocent unreality, at least in our present conscience. I'm telling you all of this because I really do hope that it's something that we're able to explore together. Maybe not myths to be passed down from generation to generation, but certainly storytelling involving some of the mythological creatures we already know. Whether it's unicorns or selkies, mermaids or the Loch Ness Monster, looking at these stories would allow us some kind of entry into examining English in a deeper way. Well, that's it from me today. There's no video to go with this podcast because I just wanted to do one off the cuff. That means rather informal, without preparation. There we are. I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you are still celebrating Burns, do have some haggis, and I wish you well. Bye.